The rocks I'm standing on here are around about 5 to 6 million years old. And they were deposited in shallow water, probably not unlike what we can see just out here at the moment in around about perhaps 10 to 20 meters depth. Above them, the whiter rocks were deposited much later, but probably not in a marine situation. They were probably almost certainly deposited in coastal dunes and coastal shallow waters that may or may not have been brackish. 5 to 6 million years ago, there were very, very different animals living on this beach to what we see today. There were large marsupials, and there were in the waters many carnivorous animals such as sharks and fish, even crocodiles. What was going on was there were storms and things inland, and animals and trees would push down in storms and the rivers to the beach where they sunk, but they also provided food for animals in the water. The large marsupials that walked around here were probably like a small hippopotamus, and they are now long extinct. In the water we had very large sharks, significantly larger than the white pointers we would be finding today in the waters around here. But there were also other fish, and the remains of those are pretty common in this part of the world. So how do we know that the rocks here are in fact 5 to 6 million years old, and how do we know that they were deposited in shallow water? Well, firstly, quite interesting enough, there are fossils here, and these fossils, in particular the one that we're looking at here, are fossils of animals that lived in shallow water at that time. They're very similar to this living in waters out here at the present time. So what are they? Well, for a long period of time these rather unusual structures here were thought to have been the roots of plants that were fossilized. We now know this is not the case. They were produced by decapods, in fact a mud shrimp that would have been crawling along here. Every now and then there's a vertical tube where they would have come up to the surface. So these here are subterranean caverns or burrows that have been made by these shrimps and were connected to the surface by vertical tubes. Now, the colour. Why are the rocks here brown in colour? Well, this is because they were selectively mineralized by iron. When I say iron, I'm talking in this particular case about an iron oxyhydroxide. But this didn't happen in the sea. This happened after the land was lifted, elevated out of the waters, and groundwater containing iron minerals seeped through it and selectively mineralized these remains. So these remains are entirely marine, and they are mineralized by a substance called goethite, which is very much like rust. It has the formula FeOOH, so it's iron oxyhydroxide. A bit higher in the sequence, the rocks are paler in colour, and this is because there's been less mineralization. As far as the aging of these rocks is concerned, in most cases we would need to have a lava flow adjacent to the sediments to definitively say how old they are. Why a lava flow? Well, lava flows have minerals in them that when the lava crystallizes or goes hard, these minerals align themselves to the actual pole, the north and south magnetic poles of the Earth at that time. But they also have present in them other minerals that decay, radioactive minerals. And these decay very slowly and very regularly. So we know which was the direction of the pole, and we also know how old it was when these things happened. Now, the fossils here are very similar to some that do occur in association with lava flows. So by correlation we are able to use those fossils, link them with these, and come up with the date that this particular sequence, the lower one here, is around about 5.6 million years old. I want to bring to your attention that we are standing in front of a cliff face. Now, a cliff face only develops when we have a situation where there is active erosion. So this whole sequence through here is actively eroding. Now, what is really important is that in geology, nothing is fixed forever. All is flux. And what we'll be looking at in the future is part of this here probably being much lower with respect to the sea. And if that happens, what we are going to be looking at is erosion very much more aggressively occurring adjacent to the road. Now, at the very top up there, there is a railing, and that is a very narrow footpath adjacent to the road itself. Now, Beach Road is a very important road that runs right along the coast here, and behind that is very expensive real estate. If the sea level rises, and the sea level almost certainly will be rising, this area will undergo much more aggressive erosion. The road itself will be threatened, and ultimately the houses behind it. Now, to assume that things are always going to be stable is unwise. Nature is always cyclic. It's going to involve situations where there's going to be build-up and also erosion of sediments. In this particular case, we're looking at erosion. The rocks that we have been looking at that form the base of the cliff face up here slowly dip towards the sea. That's important because what we see just down here are the same rocks as at the base of the cliff up there. And we can see the remains of these tubes produced by mud crabs in plan as opposed to section. And there were a lot of them here. You can see this particular structure through here is curved, the same sort of thing as there. This whole layer that runs right through here, through probably around about 20 meters or so that we could follow, is in fact produced by these mud crabs. They have a name. We call it Ophiomorpha beaumariensis. But these weren't the only things that were living in here. There were lots of other animals living here as well, and they lived within the sediment, and they are responsible for the smaller burrows through here, and here. These over here, the lumps and what looked like probably nodules or somewhat irregular surfaces, are all the burrows of animals that live within the sediment. So when this sediment was loose and soft as part of the sea floor, it was just full of animals working their way through it, consuming the goodness in it, but also using it as a system for communication and movement. So two things happen. Some of the animals feed on the materials in the sediment, and others simply use it as a place in which they can have some degree of safety or security from predators on the surface. At this particular spot, the fossils have been preferentially weathered out of the rock, which means that the goethite, which they have been selectively mineralized with, has hardened them sufficiently great that they actually are more resistant to erosion and weathering than the surrounding matrix. And the erosion has removed all the softer sediment and leaves the burrows actually proud above the surface. Now, what is really important with this one here, this is the one that typifies the beach around here. This one is Ophiomorpha beaumariensis. And you can imagine that inside this here there would have been a crab, and it would have been pushing pieces of sediment up against the walls with its chelae, and there would have been saliva and other chemicals from its mouth used to stick them all together. As a consequence, that whole surface there is nodose, and that makes this very, very distinctive and is the characteristic of this trace fossil. But there are also other types here, as we saw at the last site, and these are smooth-walled. And for example, this one down here is a much smaller diameter, and in that there may have also been crabs, but there is sections every now and then where it's much wider, and it's thought these may have been nodes for breeding, or maybe simply for turning around and going in another direction. So in this particular site here, again we see the same system. numerous burrows. Some burrows are produced by animals, not crabs, things like worms that are consuming the organic material in the soil. The ones that are preserved here are produced by crustaceans. In addition to that, we can see some much darker layers of the goethite, and this particular layer running through here, the darker layer, is in some cases quite shiny, and that is because the rocks below here had cracks when they were lifted out of the water, and the water, the mineral rich waters, flowed over the cracks and was able to deposit the goethite in thin films. The goethite is much harder than everything else, so when the soft rock erodes, we are left with shiny surfaces like the one here. The beauty of all the sites along here is the fact that they are all different. They all show things that in their own way are special and unique. In this particular site here, we've got a range of trace fossils, in other words, the burrows and the voidings of animals that lived in the past that have been preserved in a very, very delicate way. And we can see that some of these tubes here were made by worms, more likely by worms. There are still some that were made by crustaceans below down here. Now again, they have been selectively mineralized by goethite, and they do stand up very proud, these very fine tubes of the burrows that were probably made by marine worms. Over here, there are some other structures which we're not really quite sure at this particular site what they are. And these ones down here are some that we hope to be able to pick up a bit further along the sequence. But there's also something else here that's worthwhile noticing, and again it's very subtle, and that is there are some excavations or patterns that look as if they are linear. Now what produces linear structures, large linear structures like this running through here and through over there? Well, two things can do that. They can be structural, in other words they were produced by ground movement or the movement of rocks, but they can also be organic. So let's hopefully see whether we can see these a bit further along the beach. What's really important to remember and to be aware of is that if you were to go out into the water at the present time and to snorkel around and look at the bottom of the ocean, you would see that things were varying quite a lot. It's not uniform, it's not homogeneous. What we see here is exactly the same sort of thing, because in this area in front of me here, this is an area where we have something quite different that we've not seen before. Now what I'm standing on here, down below here, my feet are on the fossils that we've been looking at further along the beach. These are the Ophiomorpha and some of the burrows of annelids and crustaceans. But here it's very different indeed, because these once were a colony of many organisms that had tubes that were primarily in a vertical mode. And these are polychaetes. So what we had here was a colony of polychaetes that are a type of worm that lives in a vertical chitinous tube. And these tubes were superb in being able to be preserved with the goethite. So the whole zone through here was probably alive once with these worms, and they had at the end of them a structure with cirri or little cillae on it that attracted and caught pieces of plankton and other materials in the water column and fed off them. So what we would have been looking at here would have been alive with these little structures beating away in the water. What we have here is an even better exposure of these polychaete tubes. And if we have a look down here, we can see that they are not only vertical, many of them do have nice vertical arrangements or structures, but they also have quite a very, very complicated lateral network as well, which is unusual. But nonetheless, I believe these here very, very accurately represent what a bed or thicket of polychaetes would have preserved like. And it's not very often we get something as beautifully preserved as this. In this particular case here, there is almost no soft sediment left, and the polychaete tubes have been beautifully weathered out, and we can see them in all of their glorious beauty. What's really interesting about this, and what's important to remember, is that they are probably significantly wider now in the way they've been preserved than they were once when they were living. One thing that is really interesting with this beach here is the sand itself that makes up the beach, because the sand is comprised of minerals that are not obvious or common in the rocks, particularly the rocks on the beach here and the ones we've been looking at. If we have a look at these, we see that the sand grains themselves are large. They're sort of coffee crystal size, and they are all made of, primarily, ignoring the shells of course, but these sand grains are primarily quartz, so they are silicon dioxide. Where do they come from and how did they get here? Well, there are two ways we could look at this. Many of the beaches here have been nourished by the council bringing in sediment from other places, but in this particular case here, these sand grains can be seen to be from the upper part of the sequence on the cliffside. And these presumably formed in a beach environment very much like what we have today, but from ancient granitic rocks. And they have been worn. They comprise part of that original sedimentary rock, the paler colour one we saw. They were eroded out of that, and they're on the beach again now, and presumably one day these too will be reincorporated into a sedimentary rock of the future. Earlier on we talked about the structures, the linear features that were present on the beach. Well, this particular site here at the end of our beach walk has something that is really rather spectacular, because what it represents is in fact the best example of these linear features. And it begins some 2 to 3 meters in front of me and goes right past me through here and continues off in this direction. And this structure is the imprint, or the actual mold left behind by a tree. Now this tree lived 5.5 million years ago in the forests that were adjacent to the beach here. During a storm, when animals and other things were washed down, this too was washed down, and it came to rest waterlogged, sitting on the sea floor. What's really important about this is not just that it's here, this is what's not present in the tree. There is no lignin, there is no wood left at all in this. It's simply the impression of a tree trunk that fell waterlogged on the sea floor. And it's very easy to identify as a tree trunk because the impressions of the bark are preserved perfectly. And up here, which you'll see in a few minutes when we hone in on it, are the remains of teredo type worms that were eating and consuming the tree when it was underwater. So although trees can be carried out some considerable distance into deep water, these are not uncommon in this section of beach, and in fact we could find many of them, not perhaps as spectacular as this one. What we have here, unusually, is a branch. So the tree was growing, that was the top of the tree up there, the base down here. And this particular part down here in the base, we can see that it has a very changed appearance to the normal nice smooth bark or crenulated bark up there, because in this particular part here it's been burrowed. And what we're looking at here are the infillings of the burrows that were made by things like teredo worms that were burrowing into the wood as a food source when it was lying on the sea floor. Adjacent we can see some of these burrows of animals as well that obviously indicate that the actual trunk was beneath the surface when these burrows were made. So not only was it buried, but it was probably buried well over a metre or so into soft sediment, and then it began to be fossilized. They may have been eucalypts, rather like the mountain ash. So they were long, tall trees that perhaps lived a little distance from the coast itself. But almost certainly, if we use the present being the key to the past and vice versa, they were probably eucalypts. And they, in turn, became part of the rocks that make up the section of beach at Beaumaris in Port Phillip.